Last summer, in the wake of George Floyd's murder here in Minneapolis, millions of people around the country and the world took to the streets to call for racial justice and an end to police brutality against Black people. Black Lives Matter became a household phrase, and this created controversy among many white evangelicals. They said Christians shouldn't be doing things like protesting, trying to change unjust laws, or even talking about social justice at all. I heard, just preach the gospel a lot. But there was a nagging question that plagued me. What about the civil rights movement? Some of the white evangelicals telling me that Black Lives Matter was a dangerous movement, or that kingdom people shouldn't get involved in politics, or that it's not the church's job to run the world, are some of the very same white evangelicals who happily celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day every January, Black History Month in February, routinely say that racism is a sin, and believe that the church needs to be more diverse. So where's the disconnect? Well, a big part of the disconnect is that the white evangelical church have never really understood how the Black church interprets and applies the scriptures. Because the Black church doesn't fit neatly into their predefined categories of liberal or conservative. Another cause for the disconnect is that white evangelicals don't understand the role of social location in biblical interpretation. Instead of acknowledging our invested reading of the Bible, we marginalize readings that come from communities where they are upfront about theirs. And that's why Reading While Black by Reverend Dr. Esau McCaulley is not only a beautiful love letter to the Black church, the tradition that nurtured and inspires his faith, but it's also a masterclass in biblical interpretation, modern application, cultural analysis, and theological synthesis, which is exactly why it's the kind of resource that I want to recommend to you on this channel. So let's go. Hey, what's up? I'm TC. I'm a Jesus disciple, an urban minister, and a theology nerd. Welcome to Theological Graffiti, a channel that's here to equip you to learn, grow, and live out the Jesus way. Sometimes on this channel, I share my own reflections, and sometimes I interview theologians or urban ministers that I think you should get to know. And sometimes I make resource review videos like this one. If it's your first time checking out this channel and you get something out of this video, consider hitting the like button, subscribing, and ringing the bell so you'll know when new videos drop. And if you have ideas for videos that you'd like to see, you can reach out at the email in the description below. I'll also put an affiliate link to Esau McCaulley's book in the description. That way, if you decide to buy it, a small portion of your purchase will go to support the channel. You can also support the channel by becoming a patron. Whatever you decide, thanks for checking out the video. Now that's enough of that. Let's get to the review. Reading While Black, African American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope is written by Reverend Dr. Esau McCaulley, who's an Anglican priest and professor of New Testament at Wheaton College. You can see his writing in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Christianity Today. But he's also a proud son of the South, hailing from Huntsville, Alabama, which brings me to one of the first reasons why I love this book, Outcast. Theological Graffiti is obviously partly a reference to the hip-hop culture, especially the hip-hop culture that I grew up in the 90s. And that's why the first few pages of Reading While Black had me hooked. Chapter 1 is entitled, The South Got Something to Say. And unless you're a child of the 90s and hip-hop culture like me, you might not immediately get that reference. It's from Andre 3000, half of the legendary hip-hop group Outkast. And he said that at the infamous 1995 Source Awards.
Pressure can either bust pipes or create a diamond, and what Andre said when he got on that microphone created a diamond.
But it's like this though, I'm tired of folks, you know what I'm saying? Them closed-minded folks, you know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and don't nobody want to hear it, but it's like this, the South got something to say, that's all I got to say.
Everybody was like this on their seats, like, from there, it was a wrap.
For me, it might as well have been the national anthem.
The South got something to say.
See Andre, Big Boy,
dudes who were from right here, our area, man, Southside, East Point, and get up there, man, and say the South got something to say, man, it turned everybody up.
And it finally gave clear cut and incision from New York wannabeism. It was a great thing that they were handled in that way, because it finally cut the umbilical cord, saying we don't have to impress you, we don't have to be influenced by you in the same creative way, we're going to show you.
Outcast, period.
The landscape of hip-hop in the 90s was deeply divided between East Coast artists and their record labels and West Coast artists and their record labels. And the most infamous example of this was, of course, Biggie and Bad Boy versus Tupac and Death Row. And the '95 Source Awards was one of the few venues where all these artists were together in the same place. The tension was thick, and that's why Complex Magazine called what Andre 3000 said that day a prophecy. Outkast was the vanguard of Southern hip-hop, bursting onto the scene in a powerful new way, staking its claim as part of the broader hip-hop movement. But this was a massive disruption to the East Coast, West Coast binary. At that point, there really wasn't much of a category for Southern hip-hop. Esau McCaulley brilliantly uses this as an analogy for how the Black church tradition of interpreting and applying the scriptures, how it's treated by white Christians in the US in particular. The East Coast, West Coast beef is the same kind of totalizing binary that conservative and liberal categories are for white Christians. McCaulley talks about this partly from his own experience in the white academy, but this binary is just as widespread in the white church as well. This binary doesn't leave any space for the Black church tradition that nurtured and inspires the faith of millions of Jesus' disciples in the US and around the world. For example, in seminary, McCaulley encountered higher criticism and the liberal attempt to set the Bible against social progress for African Americans. This professor argued that they needed to rescue the Bible from conservatives in order to liberate Black people. But this wasn't at all McCaulley's experience, nor the experience of millions of Black Christians like those in his own family. If the Bible needs to be rejected to free Black Christians, then such a view seems to entail that the fundamentalists had interpreted the Bible correctly. All the things that racists had done to us then had strong biblical warrant. My professor's victory felt too much like my mother's defeat. She had always told me that the racists were the poor interpreters, and we were reading correctly when we saw in biblical texts describing the worth of all people and affirmation of Black dignity. This entire debate had been crafted and carried on without any regard for the Black testimony. I was a casualty in someone else's war. This chapter is so good at setting the stage for the rest of the book, and it has so much more to say than what I've outlined here. McCaulley is quick to point out that the Black interpretive tradition isn't a monolith either. There is another strand of Black progressive readings which make up a fourth category. And McCaulley also points to how traditional Black voices are often weaponized against progressive Black scholars as pawns in the East Coast, West Coast conservative liberal culture wars. But it's what McCaulley calls the Black ecclesial tradition, the methodology of interpretation and application that largely lives in the pulpits and Sunday school rooms of Black churches. That's the primary focus of the book. And McCaulley does a masterful job of highlighting many of its strengths. Because I want you to read the book and really digest it, I'm not going to give too much away. I just want to highlight two aspects of the book that make this book a must-read. First, McCaulley highlights something that is often intentionally de-emphasized in white Christian circles: social location. Social location affects interpretation of the Bible. This cuts against the grain of white Christianity, particularly in the US, which rightfully celebrates the universal accessibility of God's Word. However, that accessibility has overwhelmingly been mediated by white and male gatekeepers, presenting only one vantage point from which to view the scriptures. The publishing companies that commission new translations of the Bible are mostly led by white men, and the translation committees of those new translations that are commissioned are sometimes entirely made up of white men, like in the case of the ESV, the English Standard Version. As a professional New Testament scholar, Esau McCaulley has publicly commented on the need for greater ethnic and gender diversity in the translation committees, only to receive highly critical pushback, mostly online. But he's right. Who is doing the translating and interpreting matters. If the Christian church recognizes that its very diversity testifies to the universal saving power of its message, then it stands to reason that the gifts and insights of various ethnicities can only be a boon to Bible translation. The insight, experience, and skills of female scholars might open our eyes to nuances that a committee of all men might miss. Christians for whom English is a second language might highlight ways in which our word choice is unclear. Similarly, Black Christians may call to mind neglected aspects of the text. The reason why highlighting the role of social location and interpretation makes white Christians a little nervous is because it names something that's shameful. There is an unjust power differential in the way that Christian faith is represented in the US. White men in particular have been looked to as the norm and standard, while female leaders and leaders of color have been viewed as supplementary or even abnormal. When I think about this, I often hear the words of Dr. Justo Gonzalez ringing in my ears. He once wrote, "North Atlantic male theology is taken to be basic, normative, universal theology, to which then women and other minorities and people of the younger churches may add their footnotes. What is said in Manila is very relevant for the Philippines. What is said in Tübingen, Oxford, or Yale is relevant for the whole church. White theologians do general theology. Black theologians do black theology. Male theologians do general theology. Female theologians do theology determined by their sex. Such a notion of universality based on the present unjust distribution of power is unacceptable. Every valid theology must acknowledge its particularity and its connection with the struggles and vested interests in which it's involved. In the 21st century, we can no longer make the mistake of confusing the dominant for the universal. Instead, we must all acknowledge that every community has particular ways of reading and applying the scriptures. And this isn't a defect, it's an asset. Like Gonzalez said, our particularity is connected to the struggles and vested interests of our communities. In Reading While Black, McCaulley has simply been upfront about the vested interests of his community as they read and interpret the Bible. The problem only arises when other communities deny that their readings are equally invested. Which makes me think of another quote, this time by Dr. James Cone, who once wrote, "To be sure, Athanasius' assertion about the status of the Logos in the Godhead is important for the Church's continued Christological investigations. But we must not forget that Athanasius' questions about the Son's status in relationship to the Father did not arise in the historical context of the slave codes and the slave drivers. And if he had been a black slave in America, I am sure he would have asked a different set of questions. He might have asked about the status of the Son in relationship to slaveholders. Perhaps the same is true of Martin Luther and his concern about the ubiquitous presence of Jesus Christ at the Lord's table. While not diminishing the importance of Luther's theological concern, I am sure that if he had been born a black slave, his first question would not have been whether Jesus was at the Lord's table, but whether he was really present in the slave's cabin, whether the slave could expect Jesus to be with him as he tried to survive the cotton fields, the whip, and the pistol. The very questions we are seeking to answer arise from our social circumstances. And the questions that drive us affect the answers we will inevitably find. By being upfront about the kinds of questions McCaulley is seeking to answer, and by owning the invested reading of his community, he's able to supply the broader church the valuable insights that otherwise would have been missed. This is where the book really shines. McCaulley tackles some of the most pressing questions for Black Christians in the US today. And by modeling this methodology, he pulls back the curtain for other readers to see how we all have invested readings, just different ones. In Reading While Black, there's a chapter dedicated to what the Bible teaches about protest and the political witness of the church. There's a chapter dedicated to the reality of Black anger and lament. And there's a fantastic chapter dedicated to what the Bible teaches about slavery. Since I want you to actually read the book, I'm only going to highlight the chapter dedicated to the theology of policing. Here, we can see precisely why this book is so necessary. McCaulley points out that often when injustice surrounding policing practices is brought up in white Christian circles, the gravity of the biblical witness centers the conversation around Romans 13, with the assumed interpretation of submission to authority, as if this text was the only thing the New Testament had to say about the Christian's relationship to civil authorities. But in this chapter, McCaulley will go on to show the New Testament has much more to say on this subject than just Romans 13. But he goes even further than that. He also shows that because of invested readings, which center the experiences and social locations of the dominant culture, a critical part of even Romans 13 has been overlooked. He writes this: Paul provides a few starting points on how Christians can think about policing from a biblical theological perspective. He rightly focuses on who controls the sword and not merely the individual. This gives the Christian thinker and advocate the space to think structurally about how a just society should treat its people. Paul also speaks about the absence of fear, a central concern for black folks. Yes, Paul does speak about the Christian's responsibility to the government. This is fine. We do not want anarchy. We gladly acknowledge the potential goods of government. We also recognize the church's ability to discern evil in government actions, even if we lack the sovereignty over history to know when God will bring judgment. Nevertheless, we must always remember that Paul's words on submission to government come in the context of a Bible that shows God active in history to bring about his purposes. God lifts up and God tears down. To avoid that tearing down, those who have the task of government must do all in their power to construct a society in which black persons can live and move and work freely. Because of McCaulley's formation in the black church tradition, and because he's unashamed of his own invested reading of the text, he's able to point out something that often goes overlooked by white Christians due to their invested reading. Namely, the same text that tells Christians to submit to the governing authorities also tells the governing authorities to construct a just society in which the people do not have to live in fear. This text is so often used to silence dissent when police officers abuse their authority and the black community speaks out. This text is precisely the same text that justifies black protest against unjust policing policies and practices. A faithful reading of the scriptures will challenge our assumptions and move us towards greater love for every person, so that we are actively partnering with God in the renewal of all things. And that's why this channel exists. I want you and your community to be equipped to learn, grow, and live the Jesus way. And that's why I highly recommend you check out Reading While Black by Reverend Dr. Esau McCaulley. I'll make sure to put all the relevant links in the description below. Leave me a comment if you got something out of this video, or if you picked up the book and started reading it. I'd love to hear your feedback. And until next time, peace.